what does it truly mean to be happy? Is it just, a feeling that comes and goes, or maybe a deeper state of mind? Or is it something bigger, like living a really good, flourishing life?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It really is. And how does this really personal quest for happiness connect with the much broader idea of how we make moral decisions for society as a whole?
Yeah, it's a huge connection.
Today, we're diving deep into exactly these questions. We're exploring this fascinating and sometimes, let's be honest, really complicated world where individual well-being bumps up against the big ethical framework of utilitarianism.
It's a collision sometimes.
Right. Can we ever truly build a good society when even defining what's good for just one person is so complex? Never mind for, billions of people. That's kind of the meta dilemma we'll be wrestling with today.
It's a really compelling question, and these aren't just abstract philosophical ideas stuck in old books, are they?
Not at all.
They subtly and sometimes pretty overtly shape our individual lives, from the little choices we make every day to the big public policies that govern whole societies. Understanding them is, I think, really key to understanding ourselves and the world around us.
Absolutely. And to unpack all of this, we're drawing from a really rich mix of sources today. We've got stuff from philosophical encyclopedias, for the solid definitions, but also cutting-edge research from academic journals.
Yeah, that variety is great because it lets us look at these complex ideas from, multiple angles. Gives us a much more comprehensive view, hopefully.
So our mission today is pretty clear. We want to clarify what happiness really is, explore how scientists try to measure it, and that comes with its own set of really interesting challenges, believe me.
Oh, definitely. Measurement is a whole can of worms.
Yeah, and then we'll unpack the ethical framework of utilitarianism. We'll look at where it came from, its modern forms, and we have to tackle the serious criticisms it faces.
Right. By the end, you should have a much clearer picture of how these powerful ideas fit together, where they agree, where they diverge, all without, hopefully, getting totally overwhelmed.
Sounds like a plan.
Yeah.
Let's start peeling back the layers. So this first big question, what is happiness? Because, it turns out the word itself can mean a couple of different things, and getting that distinction clear is pretty crucial, right?
That's exactly right. Philosophers often talk about two main senses or meanings of happiness. The first one is what we usually call the psychological sense.
Psychological sense. Okay, so that's like how you feel inside.
Pretty much. In this view, happiness is essentially a mental state. It's a subjective experience. It's about your internal emotional landscape, your mood right now, your level of joy or contentment. It's that feeling.
And what's really interesting about this psychological sense, I think, is that you could actually argue that this kind of happiness isn't necessarily valuable, like at all.
Yep.
Well, imagine, say, a really high-achieving intellectual, someone always pushing boundaries, seeking knowledge. They might look at someone who seems perfectly happy, maybe a bit simple, blissfully ignorant, perhaps, and actually pity them.
Right, thinking that only ignoramuses can be happy in that simple, just feeling good kind of way.
Exactly. They might believe the real value lies somewhere else, maybe in intellectual struggle or profound experiences, even if those things don't always come with, happy feelings.
That's a strong counterintuitive point, but it's a valid perspective within this psychological framework. And for our deep dive today, we are mostly going to focus on this psychological sense, happiness as a feeling or state. But we definitely need to acknowledge that debate is ongoing.
Okay. But you said there were two senses. What's the other one?
The second one is the well-being sense. This is sometimes called prudential value or welfare, utility, even flourishing.
So this is less about just feeling good right now and more about whether your life is actually going well for you. Like, are you thriving?
Precisely. In this sense, happiness is about what genuinely benefits a person, what's truly good for them, what makes their life better overall, serves their interests. It's about being in an enviable state, being fortunate.
Okay, benefit, good for them.
And here's a really key distinction that often trips people up. Something can be good, period, just generally good, without necessarily being good for a specific person.
Okay, unpack that a bit. Can you give an example? That sounds subtle but important.
Sure, think about honesty. Most of us would agree, I think, that honesty is good, period.
Yeah.
It's a virtue, right? Something inherently positive.
Yeah, generally speaking.
But imagine a situation where telling the truth might require a huge self-sacrifice or even put you in danger. In that specific case, being honest might not be good for you, even though honesty itself is still good, period.
I see. So the universal value versus the personal benefit in a specific situation.
Exactly. And it's interesting, the word happiness itself actually comes from the Middle English word hap, meaning fortune or chance. So good hap meant good fortune. That clearly links to this well-being sense. A happy person is, in a way, a fortunate one, someone whose life is going well.
That etymology really connects the dots there. Okay, so we have the feeling sense and the well-being sense. Now, when we talk about defining happiness, you also mentioned we need to be careful about the kind of question we're asking. What did you mean by that?
Right. We need to distinguish between asking what is happiness, which is about its fundamental nature, its definition, and asking what makes us happy, which is about its sources or
Oh,
causes.
okay. The what versus the how or why.
Exactly. And people often mix these up. It's where, laypersons and philosophers sometimes talk past each other. If you ask someone on the street, what is happiness? They might say something like, oh, happiness is being with good friends.
Which sounds nice, and probably true for many people.
It's a lovely sentiment, and friends are definitely a common source of happiness. But that statement doesn't actually define what happiness is. It's not telling us about the fundamental nature of the state of happiness itself. It's telling us what causes it or contributes to it.
So the philosopher or the scientist, they want to define the underlying state first. Understand what it is before they can properly investigate what causes it. It's like needing to define water before you figure out how wells work.
That's a great analogy. Understanding what happiness is logically has to come before understanding how to achieve it. Otherwise, you might be chasing something vague, a target you haven't even clearly defined.
Which seems like a recipe for frustration.
It can be, and this brings us straight into some significant methodological challenges in actually defining happiness. It's not as simple as just picking a definition off the shelf.
I can imagine. It must be incredibly tough to settle on one single correct theory for something so subjective, so multifaceted. It's not like defining, I don't know, a chemical element.
Far from it. The concept of happiness is often called a mongrel concept, a term Ned Block used.
A mongrel concept. What does that mean?
It means our ordinary, everyday idea of happiness is actually quite messy. We use the word to point to different things in different situations, often without a really clear or consistent meaning behind it. It's sort of a jumble of related but distinct ideas packed into one word.
So it's like a word that covers a lot of ground, maybe too much ground, and we need to carefully untangle the different threads it represents.
Exactly. And this is where traditional philosophical methods like conceptual analysis, where you try to break down concepts into their essential components, often struggle when applied to happiness. They show a poor fit.
How so? Can you give an example?
Sure. Take hedonism, the view that happiness is simply pleasure, or maybe the balance of pleasure over pain. Now, pleasure is obviously a big part of what we think of as happiness.
Right. Seems central.
But critics argue that just summing up pleasures doesn't fully capture our intuitive understanding. Our gut feeling often points towards happiness being a more complex emotional state, maybe involving deeper feelings like contentment or tranquility, not just a series of momentary pleasures. It has a richer texture.
Okay, so hedonism might be too simplistic. What about other attempts, like defining happiness as life satisfaction? I hear that one a lot in, psychology research.
That's another major contender and another great example of the difficulties. Some argue that happiness is being satisfied with your life as a whole when you step back and evaluate it.
Makes sense on the surface.
But consider the suffering artist thought experiment. Imagine an artist who experiences a lot of negative emotion, maybe depression or angst, but feels their life's work is incredibly meaningful and affirms their life wholeheartedly. They might report high life satisfaction, valuing their creative struggle over emotional ease.
Yet we'd probably hesitate to call them happy in the everyday sense, right? Even if they say they're satisfied.
Exactly. It seems counterintuitive to call someone deeply suffering happy, even if they cognitively endorse their life. This highlights a potential disconnect between a rational evaluation of your life and your actual felt emotional state. Life satisfaction might be part of the picture, but maybe not the whole story of happiness.
So if these traditional philosophical methods and common definitions run into trouble, are we just stuck? Is there another way to approach defining happiness?
Well, not necessarily stuck. One alternative approach is to focus on practical utility. Instead of asking, what does the word happiness perfectly describe, we ask a different question.
Which is?
Which conception of happiness best serves our interests in having the concept in the first place? Why do we care about happiness? And which psychological states that fall under the umbrella of the ordinary word happiness make the most sense of why we care? What function do we want this concept to perform for us?
So it's less about finding the one true definition carved in philosophical stone, and more about finding the most useful definition for what we're actually trying to achieve, whether that's personal growth or making good policy or just understanding ourselves better.
Precisely. Ultimately, maybe being super clear about the phenomena we're interested in the actual experiences like sustained joy, deep contentment, a sense of meaning, is more important than getting hung up on the exact definition of the single word, happiness. We need clarity on what we're trying to understand and maybe cultivate, regardless of the label we stick on it.
That feels like a much more pragmatic way forward. Okay, so we've grappled with the philosophical deep end of defining happiness. Now, let's shift gears a bit and dive into the science. Can happiness actually be measured?
Yeah.
And what are the researchers finding when they try to, put this slippery concept under the microscope?
Right, this is where the empirical work comes in. And honestly, the scientific literature on happiness, or subjective well-being as it's often called in psychology, has just exploded in recent decades.
It seems like a really hot topic.
It is. It's a vast field, but we can definitely pull out some key empirical findings that have emerged as sort of consensus positions among researchers. They've crunched a lot of data.
Okay, hit us with the highlights. What are the big takeaways we should know about?
Well, first, and this might be surprising to some, especially if you watch the news a lot, is that most people report being happy.
Really?
Most people.
Yes, that's a general consensus among subjective well-being researchers. This is supported by large-scale surveys where people self-report their levels of happiness, their life satisfaction, and also by studies looking at the balance of positive versus negative affect or feelings. On average, people tend to experience more positive emotions than negative ones.
Wow. Okay, so maybe things aren't as bleak as they sometimes seem. That's kind of comforting.
It can be. A second major finding, and this one is really fascinating, is that people tend to adapt to most changes in their circumstances, both good and bad. Over time, they tend to return to a kind of baseline happiness set point.
This is the hedonic treadmill idea, right?
Exactly. That's the famous concept. You might get a big happiness boost from winning the lottery or getting a promotion, or a big dip from a setback. But the idea is that eventually you tend to drift back toward your personal baseline.
So chasing external achievements or possessions might not be the key to lasting happiness because we just adapt to them.
That's a major implication, yes. Our internal happiness regulation systems often seem to override external events in the long run. It suggests, true, sustainable well-being might lie more in internal factors or practices, rather than just accumulating external goods or successes. It's a profound insight into our psychological makeup.
Okay, adaptation and set points. What else?
A third finding, perhaps a slightly less comforting one, is that people are often prone to making serious mistakes in judging what will make them happy and in pursuing it. We're not always great predictors of our future feelings.
We think buying that new gadget will make us happy forever, but it doesn't.
Often, yes. Or we overestimate how long the happiness boost will last. This is sometimes called effective forecasting errors. We misjudge the intensity and duration of our future emotional responses. This means we can end up chasing things that don't deliver the lasting satisfaction we expect.
Which, again, has big implications for how we live our lives and maybe even for public policy. If we're bad at knowing what makes us happy, how can we design a society that promotes it?
That's a fantastic question to keep in mind as we move towards utilitarianism. And one final key finding I'll mention is that material prosperity seems to have a surprisingly modest impact on happiness, at least beyond a certain point.
The old money can't buy happiness, Sam. Is there truth to that scientifically?
There seems to be, especially once basic needs are met. Research, like some famous work by Kahneman and Deaton, suggests that while higher income does correlate with higher life evaluation, how people think about their life when they step back, it is a much weaker correlation with day-to-day emotional well-being or positive feeling above a certain income threshold.
So more money might make you rate your life as better overall, but it doesn't necessarily translate into feeling happier moment to moment once you're reasonably comfortable.
That seems to be the pattern. It appears that psychosocial prosperity, things like strong social connections, a sense of purpose, autonomy, might be a stronger predictor of positive feelings than just having more money.
That distinction between life evaluation and positive feeling is really interesting. It almost perfectly mirrors the two senses of happiness we started with, the well-being sense and the psychological sense.
It really does. Life evaluation maps quite well onto that well-being or flourishing idea. Is your life going well, objectively? And positive feeling maps directly onto the psychological sense. How good do you actually feel? It's fascinating to see how the science is now providing data that reflects and refines these long-standing philosophical distinctions.
It's like a feedback loop. Philosophy poses the questions, science gathers data, and the data sends us back to refine the philosophy. That's what makes this kind of deep dive so interesting.
Absolutely.
But, okay, let's get into the real nitty-gritty now. How do scientists actually measure this stuff? Because measuring something as internal and subjective as happiness sounds, well, really hard. What are the technical problems they run into?
You're right. It is far from straightforward. One major challenge researchers face is the fact that different aspects of well-being often show surprisingly low correlations with each other.
Meaning, different ways of being well don't necessarily go hand in hand.
Exactly. For example, studies have found a very weak correlation, something like 0.1, which is tiny, between what researchers call eudaimonic behavior and hedonic behavior.
Okay, wait. Eudaimonic and hedonic. Can you quickly refresh us on those, just so we're all clear?
Sure. Hedonic basically refers to seeking pleasure and avoiding pain. Think immediate gratification, positive feelings. Eudaimonic relates to a deeper sense of well-being, living a life of meaning, purpose, virtue, self-realization, think flourishing.
Got it. Pleasure versus purpose, roughly speaking.
Roughly, yes. So the fact that behaviors linked to these two only correlate at 0.1 suggests that someone pursuing pleasure isn't necessarily acting in ways that promote meaning or virtue, and vice versa. It kind of passes the common sense sniff test, right? The stereotypical hedonist isn't usually pictured as someone deeply focused on self-realization or community contribution.
Yeah, that makes intuitive sense. They seem like different paths almost.
They often are, behaviorally. Even when you look at underlying goals and motives, the correlation is still only moderate, maybe around 0.4, between eudaimonic goals and using pleasure as a means to achieve them. And for overall orientations to happiness, whether someone primarily identifies as pursuing pleasure versus meaning, the correlation is even lower, around 0.2.
Wow.
And what's really striking is that some research finds no connection at all between what are called intrinsic aspirations, things like personal growth, community feeling, relationships, and hedonic aspirations, like seeking pleasure or sensory enjoyment.
No connection. That's pretty stark.
It is. It suggests these different dimensions of a good life, while maybe conceptually related in our minds, don't necessarily move together in how people actually live or what they strive for. This makes measuring a single, unified concept of happiness incredibly complex. Which aspect are you actually capturing?
Right. You might measure one thing but miss another completely. Okay, so low correlations between different aspects is one problem. What other technical issues pop up, especially when you rely on people telling you how happy they are via surveys?
Yes. Response biases are a huge challenge in self-report measures. People aren't always perfectly objective or consistent reporters of their own internal states. Their answers can be influenced by various unconscious factors.
Like what kind of factors?
One common one is the extreme response style, often abbreviated as ERS. This is the tendency some individuals have to predominantly use the extreme ends of a rating scale. They're always picking strongly agree or strongly disagree, 1 or 7, regardless of the nuances of their actual feelings.
So they avoid the middle ground. Everything is black or white.
Pretty much. It's like they only have an on or off switch for their opinions. And research, like a 2016 meta-analysis, suggests there can be demographic differences in this tendency. For instance, that study indicated that individuals identifying as Black and Hispanic tended to show more ERS, while whites and Asians showed less. There were also slight gender differences, with females showing a bit more ERS than males.
Interesting. And does this extreme responding link to other biases?
Yes, ERS tends to positively correlate with another bias called the acquiescent response set, or ARS.
Acquiescence. That's like just agreeing with things.
Exactly. ARS is the tendency to agree or say yes to survey questions, pretty much regardless of their content, just a general tendency towards affirmation. And ARS itself is a known confounder that researchers have to be really careful about and try to control for.
Okay, so you've got people potentially overusing the ends of the scale and a tendency for some to just agree with everything.
Oh.
That sounds like it could seriously mess up the data and make it hard to know what you're really measuring.
It absolutely can skew results significantly if not accounted for. And these are just two examples. There's a whole range of potential response biases, social desirability bias, mood effects, question order effects. It's complex. This all feeds into the broader confounder problem.
Confounders. Those are other variables that might be influencing the results,
Right.
making it look like two things are related when they aren't, or hiding a real relationship.
Precisely. When you're trying to establish if, say, income causes happiness, you need to control for all the other factors that might influence both income and happiness. Things like health, education, personality traits, social connections, maybe even genetics, cultural background. The list is potentially endless.
Trying to isolate the true effect sounds like a massive task.
It requires immense effort, statistically and methodologically. And the really tricky part is you can never be 100% certain you've identified and controlled for all possible confounders. There might always be some lurking variable you haven't thought of or measured.
Which
is why some scientists are quite cautious, expressing doubt that you can ever definitively prove causality in complex observational research like this, especially with something as multifaceted as happiness. There's always that lingering uncertainty, that possibility you've missed a key piece of the puzzle. It's a humbling aspect of the scientific process in these areas.
That's a really important dose of scientific humility. But surely researchers aren't just throwing up their hands. Are there practical strategies they use to try and mitigate these measurement problems, at least partially?
Oh, absolutely. They employ various techniques. A very common and practical mitigation strategy, especially for tackling acquiescence bias, is using item direction balance in questionnaires.
Item direction balance, what does that involve?
It's pretty straightforward, actually. Instead of phrasing all the questions so that agree always means happy or positive, you mix it up. For some questions, agree might indicate happiness, but for others, disagree might indicate happiness.
So you might ask, I often feel joyful, where agree is positive, but then later ask, I rarely feel content, where disagree is positive.
Exactly. You switch up the implied good and bad answers. This forces respondents to actually read each question carefully and think about their answer, rather than just falling into a pattern of agreeing or disagreeing with everything.
Clever. So you can't just mindlessly tick the same box all the way down and get a consistently high or low score.
Right. It's particularly effective against that acquiescence bias, ARS, because someone tempted to just agree with everything won't consistently inflate or deflate their score in one direction. While achieving perfect measurement of something like happiness is probably impossible, techniques like this, along with sophisticated statistical controls, help make the data much more robust and reliable. It's an ongoing process of refining the tools to get a clearer, less biased picture.
That makes sense. It's about making the measurement as good as it can be, even if it's not perfect. Okay, so we've unpacked the complexities of defining and measuring happiness. Now let's pivot to the big ethical framework that directly engages with this idea of maximizing well-being, utilitarianism. And to really understand utilitarianism, we have to start at the beginning with its foundational figure, Jeremy Bentham. He really architected this whole way of thinking, didn't he?
He absolutely did. Bentham laid the groundwork for what we now call classical utilitarianism. He built a system that was genuinely revolutionary for his time, the late 18th and early 19th centuries. His core idea is famously known as the utilitarian principle, or sometimes the principle of utility.
And what does that principle state, in essence?
In essence, it states that actions or deeds, as he sometimes called them, should be judged right or wrong based solely on their consequences, specifically their capacity to increase happiness and decrease suffering. The ultimate goal is always to produce the greatest good or the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people.
So every single decision, every law, every individual action should ultimately be put to the test. Does it create more overall happiness and less overall suffering? It sounds very results-driven.
It is fundamentally results-driven or consequentialist. And this core principle led Bentham to some pretty radical views, especially concerning justice. For Bentham, justice wasn't some inherent divine or natural concept existing independently out there.
No. What was it then?
He saw justice as a social construct. It's something we humans create with a very specific practical purpose in mind, to maximize enjoyment and minimize pain for as many individuals in society as possible.
Wow. Okay, so that's a very different take than, say, justice being about fairness or rights in some abstract sense. For Bentham, the legal system isn't about upholding abstract ideals. What about being a pragmatic tool for societal well-being?
Absolutely. He believed the entire purpose of the legal system and the laws it creates is to promote a just society by achieving these utilitarian goals, maximizing happiness, minimizing suffering in an impartial way. Laws should be based on objective principles that demonstrably promote the general welfare and prevent harm.
And this contrasts sharply with ideas based on natural law or inherent morality.
Very much so. Bentham was deeply skeptical of concepts like natural law and natural rights, which were influential in his time. He famously called natural rights nonsense upon stilts.
Nonsense upon stilts. That's quite a phrase. Why was he so dismissive?
He believed that appeals to natural law or inherent morality were often just rhetorical devices used to justify the interests of the powerful, or to impose particular views without providing concrete evidence of benefit. He saw them as vague, unprovable, and potentially manipulative.
So he wanted to replace those potentially fuzzy concepts with something more concrete and measurable.
Exactly. He strongly advocated for a utilitarian approach to both morality and politics. The sole legitimate basis for creating a just and moral society, in his view, was the demonstrable promotion of happiness and the prevention of harm, things you could, in principle, observe and measure by looking at their effects on people's lives. Pleasure and pain were, for him, the sovereign masters governing human behavior and the ultimate bedrock of ethical evaluation.
It's almost like he wanted to make law and morality scientific, grounded in observable facts about human experience.
That's a good way to put it. This thinking led directly to his development of legal positivism. This is the view that the legitimacy of laws comes not from their moral content, but from their source specifically, from being enacted by a recognized sovereign authority, like a parliament or ruler. Law is what the sovereign commands.
So a law could be legally valid even if it's morally questionable, according to this view. The ease of law is separate from the ought of morality.
Precisely. Bentham insisted on this distinction between legal analysis, what the law is, and moral considerations, what the law should be. This emphasis on observable legal principles and their practical consequences, rather than relying on abstract moral justifications, had a profound influence on the development of modern legal theory and criminal justice. But always, underlying his view of how law should be made was his greatest happiness principle. Rules should be crafted specifically to minimize suffering and maximize enjoyment for the largest number. It's a pragmatic, forward-looking, consequences-focused approach to law and governance. That provides a really clear foundation for how a utilitarian sees the purpose of law. But even within that practical framework, Bentham had to grapple with the complexities of consequences, didn't he? He made a really interesting distinction between evils of the first and second order. Can you unpack that for us? It sounds important, but maybe not immediately obvious. Yes, this distinction comes from his work, The Theory of Legislation, and it's crucial for understanding utilitarian justifications for punishment, or why we deem certain actions illegal even if the immediate harm seems small. First-order evils are the immediate, direct consequences of an action. They are the harm or suffering experienced directly by the individuals involved in the act itself.
Okay, the direct hit and second-order evils, those are the ripple effects.
Exactly. Those are the wider consequences that spread through the community beyond the immediate victims. They cause what Bentham termed alarm, a general sense of insecurity or fear and danger, the likelihood that similar harmful acts will occur in the future if the first one goes unpunished or unchecked. They're the systemic impacts.
So how does this distinction help explain why we punish, say, a seemingly minor crime, especially one where the perpetrator might have actually benefited?
Bentham uses the classic example of a poor beggar stealing a loaf of bread from a rich man. If we only look at the first-order evils, the immediate effects, we might argue the good for the starving beggar, saving him from hunger, outweighs the minimal evil or harm suffered by the rich man who lost one loaf. From just that narrow perspective, it's hard to see why the law should punish the beggar severely, or maybe at all.
But intuitively, most people feel stealing is wrong. Even in that desperate situation, there must be more to it.
And that's precisely where the concept of second-order evils becomes essential for the utilitarian justification of punishment. Stealing isn't primarily a crime because of the harm done to the rich man in this specific instance. It's a crime because of the alarm and danger that would spread throughout society if such actions were generally tolerated.
How so? What's the broader danger?
If people believed they could just take what they needed whenever they felt desperate, the very foundations of property rights and social order would crumble. No one would feel their possessions were secure. This would create widespread fear, alarm, and instability, danger, ultimately leading to far more suffering for everyone than the initial act caused. The second-order evils, the damage to social trust and security, vastly outweigh any first-order good achieved by the thief.
So the punishment isn't just about the single loaf of bread. It's about upholding the system that prevents widespread chaos and insecurity. It's about preventing the whole bakery from collapsing, metaphorically speaking.
That's a perfect way to put it. It's about the systemic impact. The law has to consider the broader collective consequences and how individual acts affect the overall utility or disutility, the happiness and suffering of the entire community. It connects seemingly small, isolated acts to the maintenance of social stability, a very forward-thinking concept for his era.
It really makes you appreciate how many rules are about preventing those wider ripples of harm. Okay, so Bentham set this strong, quantitative foundation for utilitarianism. Add up the pleasures, subtract the pains. But, like any major philosophical idea, it didn't just stand still. John Stuart Mill, who was actually raised by his father James Mill and Bentham himself to be a leading utilitarian thinker, came along and made some really significant changes. What was Mill's big contribution? His crucial refinement?
Mill's most famous and arguably most important refinement to Bentham's purely quantitative approach was introducing the idea of quality of pleasures, leading to his distinction between higher and lower pleasures.
Quality over quantity. How did that work?
Bentham seemed primarily concerned with the amount of pleasure, its intensity, duration, certainty, etc. Mill argued that this was too simplistic, almost degrading. He famously stated that it's absurd that when we evaluate everything else, food, art, experiences, we consider quality as well as quantity. But when it comes to pleasure, the foundation of morality, only quantity should matter.
So for Mill, not all pleasures are created equal. The pleasure of, say, listening to a beautiful piece of music isn't just a larger amount of the same stuff as the pleasure of, I don't know, eating a tasty snack. There's a fundamental difference in kind.
Precisely. Mill argued that some kinds of pleasure, particularly those that engage our higher faculties, intellectual, aesthetic, moral pleasures, are intrinsically superior to purely physical or sensual pleasures, regardless of their quantity.
Higher pleasures.
Yes. He directly countered the criticism, which dates back to thinkers like Aristotle, that hedonism, focusing on pleasure, was a doctrine worthy only of swine. Mill insisted that no sophisticated hedonist, like the Epicureans, actually undervalued intellectual or moral pleasures. While earlier thinkers might have emphasized the circumstantial advantages of these higher pleasures, like being more permanent, safer, less costly, Mill's key move was to argue they are superior in intrinsic quality. They're just better pleasures, period.
That certainly resonates more with how many people think about different kinds of enjoyment. But how on earth do you determine which pleasures are qualitatively superior? Isn't that incredibly subjective? How did Mill propose we figure that out?
That's the critical question, and Mill proposed his famous competent judges test.
Confident judges. Who are they?
Mill argued that the only way to determine which of two pleasures is qualitatively better is to consult those people who have competent acquaintance with both. That means people who have fully experienced both types of pleasure and are capable of appreciating them.
Okay, so people who have experienced both the simple, sensual pleasures and the complex, intellectual ones.
Exactly. If these competent judges show a decided preference for one type of pleasure over the other, even if that preferred pleasure comes with more effort, discomfort, or occasional discontent, and crucially, if they would not resign it for any quantity of the other pleasure which their nature is capable of, then we are justified in considering that pleasure superior in quality.
So if someone who truly understands both philosophy and, say, pushpin, a simple game Bentham used as an example, consistently prefers philosophy, even with its frustrations, that tells us philosophy offers a higher quality pleasure. They wouldn't trade the potential for deep insight for any amount of simple amusement.
That's the core idea. Mill famously wrote, "It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. And if the fool or the pig are of a different opinion, it is because they only know their own side of the question. The competent judge knows both sides."
What if the judges disagree?
Mill acknowledged they might. In that case, he said, the majority verdict among the competent judges prevails. It's kind of democratic appeal to informed experience. He also noted, realistically, that people capable of higher pleasures might sometimes, out of temptation or weakness, postpone them for lower ones. But, he argued, this doesn't mean they don't recognize the intrinsic superiority of the higher pleasures. They know what they're missing, so to speak.
It adds a layer of sophistication, accounting for the complexity of human experience beyond just adding up units of pleasure. Now, Mill is also known for his attempt to prove the principle of utility. This sounds like a bold claim, and I know it's been controversial. What was his argument there?
Yes, this is probably one of the most debated passages in all of utilitarian literature, found in chapter 4 of his book, Utilitarianism. He's trying to offer reasons for accepting the foundational claim that happiness is the ultimate good. He uses an analogy.
An analogy.
He says, the only proof capable of being given that an object is visible is that people actually see it. The only proof that a sound is audible is that people hear it. In like manner, I apprehend, the sole evidence it is possible to produce that anything is desirable is that people do actually desire it.
Okay, so visibility is proven by seeing. Desirability is proven by desiring. Is that the logic?
That's the structure of the analogy. He then continues, no reason can be given why the general happiness is desirable except that each person, so far as he believes it to be attainable, desires his own happiness. Therefore, he concludes, each person's happiness is a good to that person, and the general happiness, therefore, a good to the aggregate of all persons.
That's been criticized, though, right? For potentially confusing desired with desirable, in the sense of worthy of being desired, and for making a leap from individual happiness being good for the individual to general happiness being good for the aggregate.
Precisely. Critics have pounced on those points for centuries, arguing it's not a logically valid proof in the strict sense. However, it's important to note that Mill himself admitted that questions of ultimate ends do not admit of proof in the ordinary acceptation of the term. He likely knew it wasn't a deductive proof.
So what was he trying to do then, if not prove it?
His aim seems to have been more modest, to offer considerations capable of determining the intellect, considerations that might persuade an honest and reasonable person to accept utilitarianism. It's less a formal proof and more an attempt to show that the principle of utility is grounded in a fundamental psychological fact about human nature, namely, that we all desire happiness. He's trying to make it intuitively plausible, showing it aligns with our basic motivations.
Okay, that makes more sense, an argument for plausibility rather than a strict proof. But what about the objection that people seem to desire things other than happiness? Like people desire virtue or money or power, sometimes seemingly for their own sake, not just as means to happiness. How did Mill handle that? Because that looks like a direct challenge to happiness being the only ultimate desire.
That's a crucial objection he anticipated. Mill's response is quite ingenious. He argues that things like virtue, money, or power can become desired as ends in themselves through association, but they initially derive their desirability from being means to happiness.
How does that work? How does a means become an end?
He suggests that virtue, for example, might initially be valued because it leads to good consequences, happiness for oneself or others, approval, etc. But over time, through habit and association, the idea of virtue itself becomes pleasurable. It becomes incorporated into our conception of happiness. It's no longer just a tool to get happiness. It becomes a part of what constitutes happiness for that person. They desire virtue as part of their happiness.
So the desire for virtue isn't a counterexample, but rather an example of how complex our idea of happiness can become, incorporating things that were originally just means.
Exactly. For Mill, good actions tend to produce pleasure and are indicative of good character, but the ultimate justification for valuing that character or virtue still rests on its tendency to contribute to the overall social utility or general happiness. Virtue is good because it generally makes the world a happier place. It all ties back to the utility principle in the end.
It's a clever way to maintain happiness as the sole intrinsic good while acknowledging the complexity of human desires. Mill really did add significant depth to Bentham's framework. But even with these refinements, the project of creating a perfectly coherent and universally applicable ethical system faced challenges. And this brings us to Henry Sidgwick, who represents in many ways the culmination of this classical utilitarian tradition. What was his big project?
Sidgwick's major work, The Methods of Ethics, first published in 1874, is often seen as the peak of classical utilitarianism, partly because of its incredible rigor and systematic approach. His main goal was ambitious. He wanted to show how utilitarianism could be reconciled with, and indeed provide a rational foundation for, our ordinary, common-sense moral beliefs. He sought to bring order and justification to the often messy landscape of everyday morality.
So he wasn't just refining utilitarianism. He was trying to demonstrate that it actually underlies and makes sense of the moral intuitions most people already have, like finding the hidden blueprint for our moral house.
That's a great way to put it. He defined ethics as the philosophical study of morality, aiming to determine objectively right actions. He identified 3 primary methods of ethics, or rational procedures people might use to decide what's right.
Okay, what were the three methods?
First, intuitionism, which relies on identifying self-evident, intuitively known moral principles like keep your promises or be fair. Second, egoistic hedonism, which argues the rational action is always the one that maximizes the agent's own happiness or well-being. And third, universal hedonism, which is essentially utilitarianism, arguing the rational action is the one that maximizes the happiness or well-being of everyone affected.
And how did he evaluate these methods, particularly intuitionism, our common sense morality? Did our everyday moral rules hold up to his scrutiny?
Sidgwick applied very strict criteria for what could count as genuinely self-evident intuitive knowledge. Principles had to be stated in clear terms, be mutually consistent, command consensus among experts, and be truly self-evident, not derived from some deeper principle.
High standards. Did common sense pass the test?
He found that most specific common sense moral rules, like rules about truth-telling or property, often failed these tests. They were often vague, had exceptions, and conflicted with each other. However, he argued that some more abstract principles did seem to meet the criteria.
Like what kind of abstract principles?
Principles like equity or justice, in the sense of treating similar cases similarly. Whatever action any of us judges to be right for himself, he implicitly judges to be right for all similar persons in similar circumstances. And rational benevolence, that one ought to aim at the good generally, not just one's own good.
And crucially, how did these abstract, seemingly self-evident principles relate to utilitarianism?
Sidgwick argued that these abstract principles were not only intuitively known, but were also fully compatible with, and indeed seemed to point towards, utilitarianism. The principle of rational benevolence, for instance, essentially captures the impartial spirit of utilitarianism. He also suggested that when our more specific common sense rules conflict, like when a promise conflicts with preventing harm, the most rational way to resolve the conflict is by appealing to utilitarian considerations which course of action will produce the best overall consequences.
So he saw utilitarianism as the underlying system that could make sense of, organize, and resolve conflicts within our common sense morality.
That was his aim, yes. He tried to show that utilitarianism wasn't some alien imposition, but the rational framework that could systematize and justify the morality we already intuitively grasp, at least in its more abstract forms.
That sounds like a pretty successful reconciliation, at least partially. But I recall you mentioning earlier that he ran into a sticking point, a tension he couldn't quite resolve.
He did. Despite his success in harmonizing intuitionism and utilitarianism, Sidgwick encountered what he famously called the dualism of practical reason.
The dualism of practical reason, what's that?
He found he could not logically reconcile utilitarianism, universal hedonism, with the other, seemingly rational method, egoistic hedonism. It seems perfectly rational to pursue one's own greatest happiness, and it also seems perfectly rational, based on those abstract intuitive principles, to pursue the greatest happiness for everyone.
But these two rational paths don't always lead to the same action, do they? Sometimes promoting the general good requires sacrificing your own.
Exactly. Sidgwick couldn't find a purely philosophical argument to prove that pursuing the general good would always coincide with pursuing one's own good. He concluded that without introducing religious assumptions like a God who ensures justice by rewarding virtue and punishing vice, perhaps in an afterlife there remains a fundamental contradiction in our practical reason. Rationality seems to point us in two potentially conflicting directions: self-interest and universal benevolence.
Wow. So at the peak of classical utilitarianism, its most rigorous defender essentially concluded that rationality itself might be fractured when it comes to morality. That's a profound and rather unsettling conclusion.
It is. Sidgwick himself found it deeply troubling. It leaves this unresolved tension at the heart of ethics, suggesting that pure reason alone might not be able to definitively tell us whether to prioritize ourselves or the greater good when they clash. It really sets the stage for later developments in ethical theory, as philosophers continue to grapple with this fundamental dualism and the practical challenges of applying utilitarian principles.
That unresolved tension really does pave the way for understanding how utilitarian thought had to evolve, trying to address these deep dilemmas and refine its application for the complexities of the real world.
Precisely. And that leads us very naturally into discussing the more modern nuances and various offshoots of utilitarianism that emerged in the 20th century and beyond, attempting to tackle these challenges head-on.
Okay, so we've traced the path from Bentham's foundation through Mill's refinements and Sidgwick's rigorous, if ultimately troubling, systematization. Now, let's explore how utilitarian thinking evolved in more recent times. There have been some fascinating developments trying to make it more practical or address its core issues. Let's start with R.M. Hare and his idea of two-level utilitarianism.
Right. R.M. Hare was a very influential moral philosopher in the mid to late 20th century, and he tackled a persistent debate within utilitarianism, the distinction between act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism.
Just to quickly recap, act utilitarianism says judge each act by its consequences. Rule utilitarianism says follow rules that generally produce the best consequences.
That's the basic idea. Hare acknowledged a common criticism. If you allow the rules in rule utilitarianism to become incredibly specific and complex to handle every possible exception, then rule utilitarianism effectively collapses back into act utilitarianism. A rule like don't lie except in conditions A, B, C, D starts to look just like calculating the best action in that specific situation.
So the rule part loses its practical usefulness if the rules get too complicated.
Exactly. Hare's ingenious solution was to say the distinction isn't about the theory itself, but about how we think morally in practice. He proposed that the key difference lies in limiting the specificity of the rules we actually use in everyday life, keeping them relatively general and simple. This led to his two-level theory, describing two distinct modes or levels of moral thinking.
Two levels. And he used these memorable hypothetical figures, the archangel and the prole, to illustrate them, right? Tell us about those.
Yes, they're very helpful archetypes. The archangel represents an ideal moral thinker. This is a hypothetical being with perfect knowledge of all the facts of any situation, complete impartiality, superhuman powers of reasoning, no biases, and unlimited time. An archangel would always engage in critical moral thinking.
Critical thinking, meaning?
Meaning they would directly apply the utilitarian principle to calculate the consequences of all possible actions in a specific situation and choose the one that maximizes utility. The archangel is capable of formulating, and if necessary, reformulating the general moral rules that are useful for others, or for themselves when operating under pressure. It's pure, unadulterated act utilitarian calculation.
Okay, sounds like a philosophical supercomputer. What about the prole?
The prole, short for proletarian, drawing on Orwell, is the opposite extreme. This is a hypothetical person who is completely incapable of critical thinking, perhaps due to limitations in knowledge, time, or reasoning ability, or maybe strong biases. The prole relies entirely on intuitive moral thinking.
Intuitive thinking, meaning they just follow the rules they've learned.
Exactly. The prole relies on relatively simple, general moral rules and principles that they've been taught or have internalized through upbringing and social custom rules like don't steal, keep your promises, help others in need. They follow these prima facie principles without engaging in complex calculation of consequences.
So in reality, Hare wasn't saying people are archangels or proles, but that we all operate on both levels to some extent.
Precisely. Hare's crucial point is that we all share the characteristics of both to limited and varying degrees and at different times. Most of the time, in everyday life, we should operate like proles, relying on intuitive thinking and following those well-established general moral rules. Why? Because critical thinking, like the archangel, is difficult, time-consuming, and prone to errors caused by ignorance, bias, or self-interest. Trying to calculate everything from scratch is often impractical and likely to lead to worse outcomes.
So the general rules are like useful heuristics or rules of thumb that generally lead to good results.
Yes. But the critical level, the archangel's perspective, is still essential. It's the level at which we justify the intuitive rules themselves, and it's the level we should try to ascend to when intuitive rules conflict, or when we encounter genuinely novel or unusual situations not well covered by existing rules, or when we are calmly reflecting on which rules we ought to teach in Fleto. Critical thinking provides the foundation for, and the court of appeal for, intuitive thinking.
That sounds like a much more psychologically realistic and practical account of how utilitarian ethics might actually work in human life. It acknowledges our limitations.
It does. It's a pragmatic way to retain the core utilitarian principle while explaining why simply following moral rules is often the right utility-maximizing thing to do in practice.
Okay, moving on from how we think about utility, let's talk about what counts as utility. Classical utilitarianism focused on pleasure and pain. But another modern variant, preference utilitarianism, takes a different approach. How does that work?
Preference utilitarianism shifts the focus from maximizing pleasure or happiness as internal states to maximizing the satisfaction of preferences or desires. The right action is the one that fulfills the preferences of the greatest number of beings involved.
So it's not about how people feel, necessarily, but about getting what they want.
That's the core idea. Key proponents include figures like John Harsanyi, R.M. Hare himself, Peter Singer, and Richard Brandt. They argued this approach was better grounded in observable behavior and respected individual autonomy more than trying to determine someone else's internal state of happiness.
Why did someone like Harsanyi, a Nobel laureate in economics actually, reject the traditional hedonistic or ideal versions of utilitarianism? What problems did he see?
Harsanyi argued, for instance, that traditional hedonism, maximizing pleasure, rests on somewhat outdated psychology. It's not obvious, he thought, that everything we do is solely motivated by seeking pleasure and avoiding pain. Human motivations seem more complex and diverse than that. He also found ideal utilitarianism, which posits certain ideal mental states like knowledge, virtue, or aesthetic experience as intrinsically valuable to be questionable. He argued it's empirically unlikely that people's only purpose in life is to have these specific mental states. People want all sorts of different things.
So he wanted a theory that was more empirical, more reflective of the actual diversity of human goals and desires. And this led him to the principle of preference autonomy.
Yes. Harsanyi strongly emphasized preference autonomy, the idea that ultimately what is good for an individual is determined by their own wants and preferences. It's about respecting what people themselves value and choose. However, and this is crucial, he added two very important caveats. It's not just about fulfilling any old preference.
Caveats. Okay, I'm listening. Because my first thought is, what if people have preferences that are based on bad information or are just plain irrational? Or what if they have preferences that are actively harmful to others?
You've hit on both caveats precisely. First, Harsanyi made a vital distinction between manifest preferences and true preferences.
Manifest versus true.
Manifest preferences are the preferences people actually express or act upon in their everyday lives. These might be based on factual errors, flawed reasoning, emotional disturbances, or simple ignorance. They might not reflect what's really good for the person.
Okay, like wanting to smoke because you mistakenly believe it's not harmful, or wanting revenge in the heat of the moment.
Exactly. True preferences, on the other hand, are the preferences a person would have if they had all the relevant factual information, were reasoning clearly and logically, and were in a calm, rational state of mind conducive to careful choice. Preference utilitarianism, according to Harsanyi, aims to satisfy these corrected, informed, rational, true preferences, not necessarily the flawed manifest ones.
That makes a huge difference. We wouldn't want an ethical system that just rubber stamps choices based on ignorance or irrationality. What's the second caveat? The one about harmful preferences.
The second caveat is the necessary exclusion of antisocial preferences. Preferences that are intrinsically hostile or harmful towards others. Things like sadism, desiring others' suffering, envy, resentment, malice must be excluded from the utilitarian calculation.
Why exclude them? If someone genuinely prefers to see others suffer, why doesn't that count in a preference-based system?
Harsanyi's reasoning was essentially that giving weight to such preferences would undermine the very concept of a moral community based on mutual goodwill. Including sadistic preferences, for example, in the social utility function would be unacceptable from a moral point of view. He argued that the part of a person's personality harboring said hostile feelings effectively excludes itself from the moral community and thus, quote, has no claim for a hearing when it comes to defining our concept of social utility. It's a way to build a fundamental baseline of benevolence into the system, preventing it from justifying actions based on pure malice, even if those actions satisfy someone's preference.
So preference utilitarianism aims to satisfy rational, informed, and fundamentally benevolent, or at least not malevolent, preferences. That's a significantly filtered set of desires.
It is. It's an attempt to create a form of utilitarianism that respects individual desires while still maintaining a strong moral core and avoiding some of the pitfalls of relying on potentially flawed or harmful expressed wants. It's a sophisticated attempt to modernize the definition of utility.
That's a really interesting evolution. Now, there's another modern variant that takes a dramatically different path, almost flipping the coin, negative utilitarianism. What's the core idea there? It sounds, well, negative.
It does sound a bit gloomy, doesn't it? Negative utilitarianism fundamentally shifts the ethical priority. Instead of aiming to maximize happiness or pleasure, its primary goal is to minimize suffering or pain. The greatest good, in this view, is achieved by reducing the total amount of badness in the world as much as possible.
Okay, so focus entirely on reducing the negatives rather than increasing the positives. I can immediately see how that might lead to some extreme conclusions. Is this where the infamous world destruction argument comes into play?
It is indeed. The term negative utilitarianism was actually coined somewhat critically by J.J.C. Smart, who pointed out this potential implication. If the only goal is to eliminate suffering, then arguably the quickest and most efficient way to achieve that goal permanently would be to painlessly exterminate all sentient life. If there's no one left to suffer, suffering is eliminated. Zero suffering achieved.
Yikes. That's a pretty devastating critique. It suggests the principle leads directly to an absolutely abhorrent conclusion. Is there any way around that, or is it considered a fatal flaw by proponents?
It's certainly the most famous and challenging criticism. However, defenders and proponents offer counter-arguments. One line, put forward by philosophers like Simon Knutson, is that classical positive utilitarianism also faces potentially counterintuitive or even repugnant conclusions when pushed to its logical extremes.
Such as?
For example, classical utilitarianism might imply that it could be morally right, or even obligatory, to kill a moderately happy population and replace them with a much larger, slightly happier population if the total sum of happiness increases, even if the act of replacement involves immense suffering. This is sometimes called the repugnant conclusion or related paradoxes in population ethics.
So the argument is that all forms of utilitarianism, when rigidly applied to extreme scenarios, can lead to conclusions that clash with our moral intuitions. The world destruction argument isn't unique to the negative version.
That's Knutson's point. He suggests the world destruction argument might not be a decisive reason to reject negative utilitarianism over classical utilitarianism, because classical utilitarianism might have implications that are just as, or perhaps even less, plausible. He even argues that in some cases, negative utilitarianism might yield more plausible results, for instance, by forbidding actions that create suffering now for the sake of greater happiness later, which classical utilitarianism might permit.
So the debate is more nuanced than just negative utilitarianism means kill everyone. There are different versions too, right? Trying to refine the idea.
Yes, there are several variations. Some distinguish between strong negative utilitarianism, only suffering matters, and weak negative utilitarianism. Suffering matters more than happiness, but happiness still counts. There's also negative total utilitarianism, which might tolerate suffering if it's compensated within the same person's life, versus negative prioritarianism, which gives extra weight to reducing the suffering of the worst off. And there's negative preference utilitarianism, which focuses on minimizing frustrated preferences, potentially avoiding the killing implication by respecting the preference to stay alive. Some versions are also influenced by traditions like Buddhism, emphasizing the pervasive nature of suffering, pessimistic negative utilitarianism.
So it's a complex family of views, all grappling with the profound ethical weight of suffering and how best to respond to it, even if the initial formulation leads to startling thought experiments.
Precisely. It highlights the deep philosophical questions around the relative importance of preventing bad versus promoting good.
Okay, one more modern offshoot before we move to criticisms. This one takes us into economics and law. Wealth maximization. How does this fit into the utilitarian family tree? It sounds more focused on money than happiness.
It's definitely an economic and legal cousin rather than a direct philosophical descendant, but it shares a core utilitarian logic of maximizing something considered valuable across society. It emerged primarily in the 20th century, rooted in welfare economics and popularized in legal theory.
And what's the connection to utility? How does maximizing wealth relate to maximizing happiness or well-being?
The theoretical underpinning often comes from the concept of potential Pareto improvements, sometimes called the Kaldor-Hicks efficiency criterion.
Okay, Pareto improvement. I know that's making someone better off without making anyone worse off, right?
Exactly. A potential Pareto improvement, or Kaldor-Hicks improvement, is weaker. It allows for changes that do make some people worse off, as long as the total gains to the winners are large enough that they could, in principle, compensate the losers and still be better off themselves.
So the total economic pie gets bigger even if the slices are redistributed unevenly and even if the compensation doesn't actually happen.
That's the key. The compensation only needs to be possible in theory, not actually paid. Wealth maximization, particularly as championed by legal scholar and Judge Richard Posner in his influential work Economic Analysis of Law, takes this idea and applies it as a normative principle for law and policy.
So how does it work in practice? What does it mean to maximize wealth?
Under this approach, a policy, law, or court decision is considered desirable or efficient if it leads to an increase in aggregate wealth. Wealth here is typically measured by willingness to pay. The value of something is determined by how much someone is willing and able to pay for it. Aggregate wealth increases if resources are moved to those who are willing to pay the most for them.
Okay, I can see the appeal it offers, a seemingly objective, quantifiable metric that avoids the difficulty of measuring and comparing subjective happiness levels between people.
That's precisely the argument made by its advocates. Willingness to pay translates diverse preferences and values into a common monetary denominator, seemingly solving the classic problem of interpersonal utility comparisons that plagued earlier forms of utilitarianism. It offers a practical decision-making tool.
I can also see a major problem immediately. Doesn't willingness to pay heavily depend on ability to pay? Doesn't this just inherently favor the rich?
That is the primary and most forceful criticism. Critics argue that because wealthier individuals or entities have a greater ability to pay, their preferences, as measured by willingness to pay, will systematically count for more in the wealth maximization calculus. A billionaire's willingness to pay $1 million for something trivial might outweigh a poor person's willingness to pay their last $100 for something essential. It risks skewing outcomes towards the preferences of the wealthy and potentially exacerbating inequality.
So it could justify policies that benefit the rich significantly at the expense of the poor, as long as the rich could theoretically compensate the poor.
That's the fear. Supporters of wealth maximization often respond to this by arguing that wealth maximization is about efficiency allocating resources to their highest valued uses, as measured by willingness to pay, while distributional concerns about fairness or equity should be addressed through separate mechanisms, like the tax and transfer system. They argue for separating the goal of making the pie bigger efficiency from the goal of slicing the pie fairly.
Equity.
It's a neat separation in theory, but whether it works out that way in practice is a huge debate. It really highlights that tension between aggregate measures and individual fairness, doesn't it? Which brings us right back to the core challenges utilitarianism faces.
Indeed, and that's the perfect transition. For all its logical appeal and its seemingly simple principle of maximizing the good, utilitarianism runs into some very significant, very thorny criticisms and challenges. These aren't just minor quibbles, they strike at the heart of the theory. Let's dive into some of the most famous and powerful ones. Perhaps the most classic and unsettling is H.J. McCloskey's sheriff scenario. This one really puts the abstract theory into a stark, uncomfortable ethical dilemma. Can you lay out the scenario for us?
Certainly. It's a thought experiment designed to test the limits of utilitarian calculation, particularly act utilitarianism. Imagine a sheriff in a small town, a serious crime has been committed, and racial tensions are incredibly high. A mob is forming, demanding justice, and they are convinced that a particular individual who happens to be black is guilty. The sheriff knows, however, based on solid evidence, that this person is completely innocent.
Okay, so an innocent person is about to be targeted by a mob.
Right. The sheriff faces a terrible choice. If they do nothing to appease the mob, or if they try to find the real culprit, which might take time or fail, severe riots will almost certainly break out. These riots would likely result in significant property destruction, multiple deaths, and a deepening of racial hatred in the community. The alternative. The sheriff could frame the innocent person, they could fabricate evidence ensuring the mob's target is convicted, thus satisfying the mob and preventing the deadly riots.
Oh, wow, okay. So the choice is frame one innocent person to save many lives and prevent widespread chaos, or uphold the innocence of that one person and allow the devastating riots to happen.
That's the brutal dilemma, and the criticism is that a pure act utilitarian, someone focused solely on maximizing overall happiness or minimizing overall suffering in this specific situation, seems committed to framing the innocent person.
Why? Because the suffering of the one framed individual, however terrible, would be outweighed by the suffering prevented by stopping the riots. Multiple deaths, injuries, destruction, fear.
That's the chilling logic. If you just run the numbers, one innocent person suffering versus many people dying or suffering grievously in riots, the utilitarian calculus seems to point towards the deeply unjust act of framing the innocent. It prioritizes the aggregate good over individual rights and justice in a way that profoundly clashes with many people's moral intuitions.
That's deeply disturbing. How do utilitarians respond to this kind of criticism? Do they just bite the bullet and say, yes, in extreme cases, framing the innocent might be right?
Some hardline act utilitarians might bite the bullet, yes, arguing that our intuitions are unreliable in such extreme, tragic circumstances. However, many utilitarians offer responses to mitigate this conclusion. A common response comes from a more rule utilitarian perspective.
How does that help?
A rule utilitarian would argue that framing the innocent violates a crucial moral rule: do not punish the innocent. They would argue that upholding this rule, even in difficult cases, produces better consequences in the long run. Why? Because having a justice system people can trust, where innocence is protected, is essential for overall social stability and well-being. Sacrificing that trust, even to prevent immediate harm, could lead to far worse consequences down the line: widespread fear, cynicism, potential breakdown of the legal system.
So the long-term consequences of undermining justice outweigh the short-term benefit of stopping the riot.
That's the argument. Another response might question the calculation itself. Perhaps the riots, while terrible, could have unforeseen positive long-term consequences, like forcing society to confront deep-seated racial injustices and implement reforms that wouldn't happen otherwise. The utilitarian calculation needs to consider all consequences, near and far, which are incredibly hard to predict.
This scenario feels very similar to other famous thought experiments, like Ursula K. Le Guin's story, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas, where a utopian city's happiness depends on the perpetual suffering of a single child. Or Dostoevsky's question about building happiness on the unrequited tears of one tortured child.
Exactly. They all probe the same fundamental question. Is collective happiness morally acceptable if it's purchased at the cost of profound injustice or suffering for an individual or a few? Utilitarianism, especially in its simplest act form, seems potentially vulnerable to answering yes, which many find morally repugnant. It forces us to confront the tension between aggregate good and individual rights.
A tension that doesn't seem to go away easily.
Okay,
Another major criticism, and this one feels very practical, is the sheer difficulty of predicting consequences. If utilitarianism requires us to calculate the outcomes of our actions to determine if they're right, how can we possibly do that when the future is so uncertain and complex?
this is a huge practical challenge, no doubt about it. Utilitarianism demands that we foresee the effects of our actions, often far into the future, across many different people. But in reality, consequences are often incredibly complex, interconnected, and fundamentally unpredictable beyond a very limited scope. Philosopher Daniel Dennett uses the term the 3-mile island effect to illustrate this.
The nuclear accident near meltdown. How does that relate to predicting consequences in ethics?
Dennett points out that it's practically impossible to assign a definitive utility value, positive or negative, to the 3-mile island incident. Why? Because we can't possibly know all of its long-term ripple effects.
Like what kind of ripple effects?
Well, on the one hand, it caused immense fear, stress, economic disruption, and potential long-term health risks. That's negative utility. On the other hand, the lessons learned from that near disaster led to significant improvements in nuclear power plant safety regulations and procedures worldwide. It's conceivable that these changes prevented future, potentially far more catastrophic nuclear accidents elsewhere.
So if it prevented a future Chernobyl, maybe 3-Mile Island was, in the grand scheme of things, a net positive. But we can't possibly know for sure.
Exactly. We can't run the counterfactual history. We don't know what would have happened otherwise. The full cascade of consequences spreading out through time and across complex systems is simply beyond our capacity to track and calculate definitively. Assigning a final utility score becomes impossible.
And if we can't reliably calculate the utility of major past events, how can we possibly calculate the future utility of our actions before we take them? Especially for complex decisions involving public policy or societal change.
That's the heart of the criticism. This inherent unknowability of the full consequences seems to undermine the practical applicability of utilitarianism as a decision-making procedure. If accurate prediction is a necessary condition for the utilitarian calculation, and accurate prediction is often impossible, then the calculation itself often seems impossible. It raises serious questions about whether utilitarianism can truly guide our actions in the real world.
That's a very powerful practical objection. Then there's the famous demandingness objection. This one hits close to home for many people because it argues that utilitarianism, particularly act utilitarianism, asks far too much of individuals. It demands an unreasonable level of impartiality and self-sacrifice.
Yes, this is perhaps one of the most persistent and intuitively compelling criticisms. Act utilitarianism requires strict impartiality. As Mill himself put it, the utilitarian agent must be as strictly impartial as a disinterested and benevolent spectator when weighing their own happiness against the happiness of others. Your well-being counts, but no more than anyone else's.
Okay, impartiality sounds fair enough on the surface. What's the demanding part?
The demanding part comes from the combination of impartiality with the requirement to always act in the way that maximizes overall utility. Given the vast amount of suffering and unmet need in the world and the countless opportunities we have to help others, especially those living in extreme poverty, a consistent act utilitarian seems obligated to make enormous sacrifices.
So it's not just about being nice or donating a bit to charity. It's about constantly calculating how you could do the most good and then doing it, even if it means radically changing your own life.
Precisely. Critics like Shelley Kagan argue that a life fully dedicated to promoting the good, as act utilitarianism seems to require, would be a severe one indeed. It could demand that people in relatively affluent societies give away almost all their disposable income and time to help those in greater need. Peter Singer famously argues for something close to this. The philosopher Brad Hooker identifies two aspects of this demandingness. First, the sheer magnitude of sacrifice potentially required from the better off, and second, the requirement to sacrifice your own interests even for a slight net increase in aggregate good, if that slight increase is multiplied across enough people.
And this also means there's no room for actions that are good but not strictly required, like no going above and beyond the call of duty.
Exactly. For a strict utilitarian, there's no such category as supererogation, morally good actions that are not obligatory. You are always obligated to do the action that produces the best consequences. Any sacrifice you make that doesn't maximize overall happiness is, from a purely utilitarian perspective, morally neutral or even wrong. It's a wasted opportunity to do more good. It makes everything a duty, potentially stripping away the space for personal projects, relationships, or even just relaxation if those don't maximize overall utility.
That sounds incredibly demanding, almost crushing. But some utilitarians actually embrace this demandingness, don't they? They argue that maybe morality is just that, demanding, especially when you consider the numbers count.
That's right. Some philosophers, like Alistair Norcross, defend the demandingness by arguing that our common sense intuitions often do recognize that numbers matter morally, especially in life or death situations. He uses examples like Homer Simpson having to choose between saving Barney from a fire or saving both Mo and Apu from the same fire. Intuitively, saving 2 lives seems clearly better and arguably morally required than saving only 1.
And Norcross pushes this further with a really stark challenge to our intuitions, doesn't he?
He does. He asks, challenging those who find utilitarianism too demanding. Can anyone who really considers the matter seriously honestly claim to believe that it is worse that one person die than that the entire sentient population of the universe be severely mutilated?
Wow, that really forces you to confront the scale. When the stakes are that high, the sheer quantity of suffering seems impossible to ignore.
It's a deliberately provocative question designed to show that, at some point, aggregate consequences seem to overwhelm concerns about individual rights or burdens. For defenders like Norcross, the demandingness of utilitarianism isn't a flaw, but a reflection of the serious moral weight of promoting well-being and preventing suffering on a massive scale. It's a feature, not a bug, a logical consequence of taking everyone's well-being seriously and equally.
So, the demandingness objection cuts both ways, a major challenge for some, a core moral insight for others. Okay, another practical criticism we touched on briefly is the idea that calculating utility is self-defeating. The argument is that by the time you've done all the complex calculations to figure out the best action, the opportunity to act might have vanished. You get stuck in analysis paralysis. How did Mill respond to this one?
This was an early criticism, suggesting utilitarianism was simply too impractical for real-time decision-making. Mill offered a very pragmatic and I think quite effective response. He basically said, we don't need to calculate everything from scratch every single time.
Why not?
Because, as he put it, there has been ample time, namely the whole past duration of the human species. During all that time, humanity has been learning through experience about the tendencies of different kinds of actions to produce happiness or unhappiness. We've collectively built up a vast body of wisdom about what generally works and what doesn't.
So we inherit this moral knowledge. We have rules of thumb, common sense principles, that generally guide us towards good outcomes. Like we know that generally telling the truth, keeping promises, not stealing these actions tend to promote overall happiness. So we don't need to calculate the utility of every single instance of telling the truth.
Precisely. Mill used the analogy of a sailor navigating the sea. The sailor uses nautical charts and landmarks derived from past voyages. They don't calculate their position from first principles using astronomy for every single decision. Similarly, acknowledging that happiness is the ultimate destination, the first principle of morality, doesn't mean we can't or shouldn't use secondary principles, those established moral rules and norms, as landmarks and direction posts along the way.
So the principle of utility justifies the secondary rules, and we generally rely on the secondary rules in practice, only resorting to direct calculation in complex or conflicting situations.
That's exactly Mill's view, and it aligns well with Hare's later two-level theory. It's a very practical defense, turning the criticism on its head by arguing that utilitarianism actually explains why we rely on common sense morality most of the time. It's not paralysis by analysis, it's informed action guided by accumulated wisdom.
That's a very elegant response.
Yeah.
Finally, let's consider the criticisms of utilitarian value theory itself. Beyond the practicalities and demandingness, some critics attack the very foundation. The idea that well-being, or happiness pleasure, is the only thing that has intrinsic moral value. What if other things matter for their own sake?
This is a fundamental challenge to the core axiology or value theory of utilitarianism. Critics argue that reducing all moral value to a single metric, whether it's pleasure, happiness, or preference satisfaction, is overly simplistic and fails to capture the full richness and complexity of the moral landscape. They argue other things might have intrinsic value too, things like justice, fairness, knowledge, beauty, autonomy, or individual rights, independent of their contribution to overall well-being.
And some critics have expressed this quite vividly, haven't they? I remember you mentioning Thomas Carlyle earlier.
Yes, Carlyle had a particularly scathing critique. He famously derided Bentham's utilitarianism, calling it a pig philosophy, echoing the earlier criticisms Mill addressed, and comparing its method to a dead brute steam engine grinding away at calculations. He described the human soul under utilitarianism as reduced to a mere hay balance for weighing hay and thistles on, pleasures and pains on.
Ouch. That paints a picture of a very mechanical, unfeeling, almost dehumanizing system.
It's a powerful rhetorical attack suggesting that utilitarianism misses something vital about human dignity and the non-quantifiable aspects of life and morality. It reduces everything to a single scale of pleasure and pain, potentially ignoring higher values or the inherent worth of individuals.
And Karl Marx also had a critique related to his value theory, didn't he? From a more socioeconomic angle.
Yes, Marx, in Das Kapital, criticized Bentham's utilitarianism, particularly its apparently universal conception of pleasure and pain. He argued that it failed to recognize that what brings people joy or suffering is heavily dependent on their specific historical and socioeconomic context. The joys of a medieval peasant are different from those of a 19th century factory owner or worker.
So Marx felt utilitarianism applied a kind of abstract, ahistorical standard of human nature and pleasure that ignored how social conditions shape our desires, our experiences, and what constitutes happiness for different groups of people. It lacked nuance about social reality.
Exactly. He suggested it took the specific desires and values of the bourgeois individual of Bentham's time and projected them as universal human nature, failing to account for diversity and social context. These criticisms, from Carlyle's focus on intrinsic values beyond pleasure to Marx's emphasis on social context, all highlight the ongoing debate about whether well-being, however defined, is truly the only thing that ultimately matters morally, or if utilitarianism's value theory is just too narrow.
It's clear that utilitarianism, while influential, faces some truly deep and persistent challenges on multiple fronts: practical, moral, and philosophical.
Absolutely. It's a framework that constantly forces us to grapple with fundamental questions about value, justice, and the very nature of the good life.
Okay, we've spent a lot of time defining, exploring the evolution of, and critically examining utilitarianism and the concept of happiness it aims to maximize. Now let's bring it all together and look at how these powerful, sometimes controversial ideas actually play out in broader societal contexts. How does this abstract philosophy influence tangible areas like the justice system, our response to global issues, or even our relationship with other species?
Right. The applications are wide-ranging and often have profound real-world consequences. A key area, as we touched upon with Bentham, is justice and criminal law. For a utilitarian, the entire purpose of the justice system isn't retribution or giving people what they deserve in some cosmic sense. Instead, justice is the set of institutions and practices that best serves to maximize total or average welfare across society.
So the courts, the police, the prisons, they are all tools designed, or that should be designed, to produce the best overall outcomes in terms of happiness and suffering.
That's the utilitarian perspective. It's entirely forward-looking. Punishment, for example, is justified only if it produces better consequences than not punishing. And utilitarians typically identify three main ways that punishment can achieve this goal. Three mechanisms by which the criminal justice system can fight crime and promote overall welfare.
Okay, what are those three mechanisms?
First, deterrence. The idea here is that the credible threat of punishment discourages potential offenders from committing crimes in the first place, general deterrence, and discourages actual offenders from reoffending, specific deterrence. Punishment serves to influence choices, tilting the cost-benefit analysis away from actions that cause harm and reduce overall welfare. The severity of punishment, from this view, should be calibrated to achieve the optimal level of deterrence, not based on notions of just deserts.
So, punish enough to scare people straight, basically, but not excessively, because excessive punishment causes unnecessary suffering.
Exactly. The goal is reducing crime statistics and the suffering caused by crime efficiently. The second mechanism is rehabilitation. The utilitarian goal here is to use the period of punishment or intervention to change offenders, to transform bad people, meaning those likely to cause suffering, into better ones who are less likely to harm others and more likely to contribute positively to society upon release. Reducing recidivism through effective rehabilitation programs directly increases overall welfare.
Makes sense. Fix the problem rather than just containing it. What's the third mechanism?
The third is security or incapacitation. This applies particularly to offenders who are deemed unlikely to be deterred or rehabilitated, perhaps those considered incorrigibly dangerous. For these individuals, imprisonment serves the utilitarian function of simply preventing them from harming others. By physically removing them from society, you limit their opportunity to cause suffering, thus protecting potential victims and increasing overall security and welfare.
So deterrence, rehabilitation, incapacitation, all justified by their contribution to maximizing overall happiness and minimizing suffering in society. It's a very pragmatic, results-oriented view of justice.
It is. It contrasts sharply with retributivist views that focus on punishment as deserved payback for wrongdoing, regardless of the consequences.
Okay, moving from domestic justice to the global stage, utilitarianism has had a huge impact on thinking about world poverty and has directly inspired the effective altruism movement. How does that connection work?
It follows quite directly from the core principle. Many utilitarian philosophers, most famously Peter Singer, argue that people living in relative affluence in developed countries have a strong moral obligation to do much more to help those suffering from extreme poverty elsewhere in the world.
What's the specific utilitarian argument for that obligation?
The reasoning is based on diminishing marginal utility and impartiality. An extra dollar or pound or euro brings far more happiness or relieves far more suffering when given to someone living in extreme poverty who might use it for life-saving medicine or basic food than it does when spent by an affluent person on a luxury item or even a minor convenience. The benefit to the poor person vastly outweighs the sacrifice for the affluent person. Since utilitarianism demands impartiality, everyone's suffering and happiness counts equally, we are obligated to transfer resources from where they do little good to where they can do immense good.
So it's about maximizing the impact of our resources on global well-being.
Precisely. And Singer and others take it a step further. It's not just about donating something, it's about donating effectively. We should research and direct our donations to the charities and interventions that are proven to be the most cost-effective, those that save the most lives or cure the most diseases or alleviate the most suffering per dollar spent.
And this focus on evidence-based, high-impact giving is the core of the effective altruism movement.
Exactly. Effective altruism is essentially applied utilitarianism, or consequentialism more broadly, in the domain of charity in global aid. It seeks to use reason and evidence to figure out how to do the most good possible with the resources we have. It's a direct, practical outgrowth of the utilitarian imperative to maximize positive outcomes.
It's a very challenging and potentially transformative application of the philosophy. It really asks us to reconsider our spending habits and our global responsibilities.
It certainly does. And the utilitarian circle of moral concern doesn't necessarily stop with humans. Another radical and highly influential application concerns other sentient beings and the critique of speciesism.
Ah, yes. Back to Bentham's famous question.
Indeed. Bentham laid the groundwork over 2 centuries ago with his incredibly prescient statement. The question is not, can they reason, nor can they talk, but can they suffer? For Bentham, the capacity for suffering was the crucial characteristic that entitled a being to moral consideration. If something can suffer, its suffering counts in the utilitarian calculus.
So rationality or language ability, which humans often use to justify their superiority, are irrelevant from this perspective. It's sentience, the ability to feel pleasure and pain, that matters.
That was Bentham's radical insight. And John Stuart Mill, despite his emphasis on higher human pleasures, explicitly endorsed Bentham's position on animals, calling it a noble anticipation of a more civilized morality. Mill argued that if any human practice, like certain farming methods or sports, causes more pain to animals than it provides pleasure to humans, that practice is morally wrong, according to utilitarian principles. The balance of utility must include animal suffering.
And contemporary philosophers, like Peter Singer again, have really run with this idea, developing a powerful critique of how we treat animals.
Absolutely. Singer is arguably the most prominent advocate for animal liberation based on utilitarian grounds. He argues forcefully that the principle of equal consideration of interests should apply to all sentient beings, regardless of their species.
Equal consideration of interests. What does that mean in practice?
It means that similar interests should be given similar weight in our moral deliberations. So the interest of a pig in avoiding pain should be given the same weight as the similar interest of a human in avoiding pain. It doesn't necessarily mean equal treatment. Pigs don't need the right to vote, but it means their fundamental interest in not suffering counts equally.
And he calls the failure to do this speciesism.
Yes. Singer defines speciesism as prejudice or discrimination based on species membership. He argues it's analogous to racism or sexism, an arbitrary privileging of one's own group, in this case Homo sapiens, over others without a morally relevant justification. From a utilitarian perspective focused on suffering, there's no rational basis, Singer argues, for discounting the suffering of non-human animals simply because they belong to a different species. Their pain is just as real and just as morally significant as ours.
That has enormous implications for things like factory farming, animal experimentation, hunting, zoos. Basically our entire relationship with the animal kingdom.
It does. It calls for a radical rethinking of practices that inflict suffering on animals for relatively trivial human benefits. Some thinkers even push the logic further. Economist Tyler Cowen, for example, has raised the provocative question of whether a consistent utilitarian, concerned about all sentient suffering, should consider intervening in nature to limit the predatory activity of carnivores to reduce the immense suffering experienced by prey animals.
Wow, trying to police the food chain? That shows just how far-reaching the implications can be when you take the principle seriously. Though it's important to distinguish this from other environmental ethics, right? Like deep ecology.
Yes, that's a crucial distinction. Utilitarianism extends moral consideration based on sentience, the capacity to experience happiness or suffering. Deep ecology, in contrast, often attributes intrinsic value to all forms of life, or even to ecosystems as a whole, regardless of whether they are sentient. For a utilitarian, a plant or an ecosystem doesn't have intrinsic moral status in itself because it can't feel pleasure or pain. Its value derives only from its contribution to the well-being of sentient creatures.
So whether we're discussing the legal system, global aid, or animal welfare, the utilitarian framework consistently pushes us to evaluate actions based on their consequences for the happiness and suffering of all affected sentient beings. It's a demanding, sometimes uncomfortable, but undeniably powerful lens for ethical analysis.
It truly is. It's a framework that, despite all the criticisms and complexities we've discussed, continues to exert a profound influence on how we think about morality, policy, and our place in the world.
And that feels like a fitting place to start wrapping up our deep dive today. What an incredible journey it's been. We started by really wrestling with what happiness even means, exploring its dual nature as both a psychological feeling and a state of well-being or flourishing. And we saw just how challenging it is to actually measure something so subjective.
Absolutely. Then we plunged into the core of utilitarianism, starting with Jeremy Bentham's groundbreaking greatest happiness principle and his pragmatic, even radical views on justice and law being tools for societal good, along with his crucial distinction between first and second-order evils.
We followed its evolution through John Stuart Mill, who added that vital layer of sophistication with his distinction between higher and lower quality pleasures and his attempt to ground utility in human desire. And then Henry Sidgwick's incredibly rigorous effort to systematize it all, trying to reconcile it with common sense morality, even while uncovering that troubling dualism of practical reason.
We then navigated the modern landscape, looking at R.M. Hare's practical two-level approach, distinguishing critical and intuitive thinking. We explored preference utilitarianism, shifting the focus to fulfilling rational desires, while carefully filtering out harmful or irrational ones. We also touched on the stark perspective of negative utilitarianism, prioritizing the reduction of suffering, and the economically focused wealth maximization principle.
And critically, we didn't shy away from the tough criticisms. We grappled with the disturbing implications of the sheriff scenario, questioning the trade-offs between individual justice and collective good. We confronted the immense practical difficulty of predicting consequences in a complex world, and the sheer demandingness of a philosophy that asks us always to maximize the good.
We also looked at defenses, like Mill's response that calculating utility isn't self-defeating because we rely on accumulated wisdom, and we examined those deep philosophical critiques of utilitarianism's core value theory. Is happiness or well-being truly the only thing that holds intrinsic value?
Finally, we saw how these abstract ideas have very concrete applications, shaping our approaches to criminal justice through deterrence, rehabilitation, and incapacitation, driving global movements like effective altruism to combat poverty, and radically expanding our circle of moral concern to include all sentient beings, challenging species.
It really underscores that these aren't just dusty philosophical debates. These concepts are alive and active, influencing our personal choices, our institutions, and our global policies in countless ways, whether we always realize it or not. It shows how fundamental questions about happiness and ethics continue to shape our world.
It really does. And it leaves us, and hopefully you, the listener, with a final provocative thought to mull over. Given everything we've discussed, the inherent complexities in defining and measuring happiness, the profound moral dilemmas that arise when we try to maximize it for the greatest number, the demandingness, the uncertainties, what personal or societal trade-offs are you ultimately willing to accept in the pursuit of the good life for all?
That's the enduring question, isn't it? It doesn't have easy answers, but reflecting on it, especially after this deep dive, might just change how you perceive your own well-being and our collective responsibility. It's a question we all implicitly answer through how we choose to live.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into happiness and utilitarianism. We hope it's given you a lot of food for thought.